Hey, how are you doing, everyone? It's Thomas with another background information episode on the automotive industry. And today's topic is about the import taxes on electric vehicles that are imposed by the European Union. So there might still be some changes to it coming, but as it looks right now, we're talking about the status quo, what's ahead, what is happening at this moment, and what implications it might have, and also where did this whole development come from, and has there been something similar in the past? So let's start with what was in the past, because in 1973 there was the oil crisis, means the oil prices were going through the roof. Actually, in Germany there were sealed off Autobahn, so the motorways where you could walk on or drive with a bicycle. Very memorable moment, because there were these car-free Sundays to save fuel actually in the population. So very interesting times right there. And this also led to a problem for American car manufacturers, because they were also really high fuel consuming. Fuel was cheap all the way in US back then, and it didn't really matter how much fuel a car consumed. Then there were the Japanese manufacturer, who had very reliable and very fuel efficient cars in comparison to the US manufacturers. Then also the labor unions in the US were more and more successful, could argue for higher wages, which is, totally justified because the wages were kind of low. And these things led to the US car industry having more and more problems. And then the Japanese manufacturers, they were exporting a lot of vehicles into the US market, and the customers at first were skeptical, but then they saw, wait a minute, they have good quality, they have good prices, and they're also more fuel efficient. So more and more US customers went for Japanese vehicles, causing more problems for the US industry. And then the politics became active actually and said, yeah, we need to protect our industry somehow. And they tried to limit the cars that come over from Japan, or also thought about special import tariffs, these taxes on the imported cars. And what they agreed at first, because they spoke to each other, was that they limit the amount of cars that are exported to the US from Japan per year. It was just under 2 million. That was supposed to be the limit. But then the Japanese manufacturers thought like, hey, how can we go around this new rule? Yeah, we could also build factories in the US, and that's exactly what happened. So the big Japanese car manufacturers like, Toyota, Nissan, Honda, they built own factories then in the US, and then it was actually fine. They actually built the factories. They also then, delivered new jobs in the US at those factories. They called construction work and so on. And of course, the people that worked in the factories and also after the construction. And that also helped to secure the market there. And even nowadays, the Japanese manufacturers are selling, very attractive in price vehicles there. They are also reliable, and they're also appreciated by the US customers. And a lot of the Japanese manufacturers make major sales then in the US, sometimes even the biggest market for them. So very interesting, definitely, what happened there. So this trade conflict was in the 1970s and also in the 1980s. And it was kind of resolved, so to speak, that the Japanese manufacturers built the factories in the US. And something similar is happening with the Chinese automotive industry. There has been these different waves. First, the Japanese manufacturers became more and more important. Then there were the Korean manufacturers, Kia, Hyundai, Genesis, especially Kia and Hyundai, of course, same corporation. They kind of followed, also stepped up the game in the quality and reliability and so on. And now it's basically the turn of the Chinese manufacturers. They tried before, but back in the days, the quality wasn't really there. They couldn't really compete. This has changed with the electrification of vehicles, because electric vehicles are not that complex in the engine technology as the combustion engines were. And also the Chinese government has decided to subsidize, especially electric vehicles, that this industry is, so to speak, like a halo industry of the whole country. And we have to know that the car industry is usually really large in all the countries where they have the factories, and all the governments are subsidizing them more or less. Also the Western industry nations, they, for example, give them special benefits if they say like, hey, we want to build a factory there, can we get like a reduction in tax or something like that. There were also special actions in Germany, for example, in the financial crisis 2008, 2009, that you could give away your old car that was being wrecked, very old ones, and then you get a subsidy amount of money for buying a new one. So all these programs were actually in place. The difference today is just that the amount of money that's going into like the subsidizing of an industry is really, really very high for the electric vehicles in China. So you can also understand that, for example, the European Union is saying like, wait a minute, there's something happening that we don't find that fair. If you subsidize that industry that much, and then our industry is not competitive anymore. So you can, argue for both sides, of course. On the one hand, a government can do what they want with the money and they can subsidize different industries. And I mean, even in Germany, for example, the Volkswagen Corporation, one federal state of Germany where the main plant is in, is also a major shareholder in Volkswagen. So in all the different countries, there are a lot of connections between the government and the big car manufacturers, for example, and more or less depending on each manufacturer. And we have to understand that even between the US and Germany, there is an import tax on cars and vice versa. It's usually around 10%. So even when, for example, BMW has a plan for their big SUVs in Spartanburg in the US, they are more expensive in Germany then. However, then when like the small SUVs or the sedans are being built in Germany and then they're getting over in the US, they are in relation and more expensive there because you have to, pay for the import or the export tax, vice versa and so on. And what has been the case so far is also when a Chinese manufacturer or also a German manufacturer builds something in China, or Tesla builds the car in China, imports it to Europe, they also have to pay the general import tax of about 10%. And that has been the case now for a very long time. And now there was then this consideration that there is an extra additional tax on electric vehicles only. And that is also very interesting. And that is basically counting for everyone. For example, Cupra also, a brand of the Volkswagen Corporation, they have major issues now with their Cupra Tavascan. It's a sister model of the VW ID4, ID5 and the Audi Q4 e-tron. And they are building that in China. And then suddenly, with the additional tax, it will become much more expensive here. Actually here I'm in Sitges in Spain at this moment here recording this video, where Cupra is also based close to in Barcelona. And this will be almost not being able to sell this car here anymore because it will not pay off for them. So maybe they will even change the factory due to that. So it is a thing that is not only affecting Chinese manufacturers. BMW has also built their iX3 model, for example, in China, where, for example, the combustion engines were built in South Africa and in the US. So it's a global network of production anyways. And now what they have decided is that depending on the manufacturer, the additional tax is different. And the interesting thing there is that they define it by how much do the brands collaborate with the European Union, with the Commission, on this tax thing. That means they want to gain insight in how much money they get, for example, from the subsidies, and they want to gain insight, on the business and so on. And it depends. For example, when you are a small brand or a brand that has a lot of good ties to the EU, you might be considered as collaborative if you give a lot of insight. If you are a bigger corporation, maybe say we don't care that much and we don't want to give them so much insight. And that's maybe not important to us than maybe other fields, or they are asking too much of us. And then they don't give all the insight that is required. Then they are being considered as not that, cooperative, and they have to pay a higher tax. And at this moment, for example, Tesla, was considered as very cooperative. That's why they only get an additional tax of about, I think, what, 9%. It will still be more expensive than when they build cars in China and then import them over. That's, for example, they will set more focus now they have the Berlin-Brandenburg plant in Germany, Tesla, and there they build the Model Y. So a Model Y will be more affordable than in Germany than the Model 3 that is being imported from China, from the plant to Germany. Then, for example, BYD and Zeekr. So Zeekr is like from the Geely corporation. So BYD and Geely will have also a relatively low tax still. So at this moment, BYD is 17.8%, Geely at around just 20%. That is already like a lower tax rate, but you have to think about this really makes it harder already on the profitability. And the worst so far is for SAIC, for the big corporation that also has the joint venture with Volkswagen to build like the VW vehicles in China. There are two joint ventures in China from Volkswagen. SAIC is one of them actually. And they are being punished by like around 37%. And that is of course huge. But now even more interesting, remember, this is only on electric vehicles. So they are also selling hybrid vehicles, for example, or plug-in hybrids in Germany, in Europe, and they don't get this additional tax. It's very interesting, isn't it? And so the SAIC Corporation also owns the MG brand, bought this UK brand, formerly UK brand, then to use it like as a, hey, you know this brand, so we can also sell it better to European customers. And they are at this moment the only brand that is selling cars in high numbers, which are produced in China from a Chinese brand. It might also have something to do maybe because that's why the taxes are quite high. So this is what's happening at the moment and what will happen in the future. So even before this tax decision, or maybe anticipating this tax decision, BYD, for example, were announcing they want to build factories in Europe or on the European continent, so to speak. And there are plans for a plant in Hungary, for example, and also maybe for a plant in Turkey. So probably the same will happen like with the Japanese manufacturers in the US. The Chinese manufacturers will build plants in Europe, produce the cars locally, not only avoiding the additional EV tax, but also the general import tax, being closer to the customer, also being more sustainable because of less transport costs and so on, and maybe also feeling more the pulse of the European customer, what they really expect and what they want. There are more corporations looking into that, what they want to do, different other brands who want to build a factory there. But we have to see who is really doing that, who will really invest even more money in Europe as for that. Also, for example, Great Wall Motors, they are also thinking about opening a plant in Europe and so on. So we have to see about the developments there. Of course, you have to have economies of scale. And the problem for the Chinese brands in Europe at this moment is, besides MG that is sold in reasonable numbers, they have a good offering, they gave good cars already, but they don't sell in so high numbers that it would actually justify this European operation. Because if you just sell a few cars per year, it doesn't pay off with like the service dealer network and the distribution, the handling of the customers and everything does not pay off at all. So you can only succeed if you also sell in high numbers. And who can sustain that? Who is big enough to sustain this period of being not profitable? And so this whole tariff thing will actually favor the big players, I feel, like BYD. At the moment, their European operations cannot be profitable, but they can sustain that and then can maybe be more profitable in the future and also when they build the European plant. Smaller manufacturers that maybe have great cars, they maybe cannot sustain the period of being not profitable, even less now with the additional taxes. So this will be even more complicated or hard for them. And then there are two very important questions left. First of all, why didn't the Chinese manufacturer attack the American market at the same time, or maybe even first? Well, there you already had 27.5% import tax. from this ongoing trade war between the US and China, so it was not really attractive to start it for them in the first place, and American customers are even more skeptical about new Chinese brands, so they will probably not do that, you know, for some time at least. And it has always been a very much higher prestige for the Chinese manufacturers to say, we succeed on the European market, especially we succeed on the German market, because it's known to be, you know, very traditionally based with the big premium German manufacturers and so on. And it would be, yeah, so to speak, the biggest prize for them to succeed on the German market and to be able to say, hey, we did it here on the German market, then we can do it everywhere. And also, what else is there to come? Why are the manufacturers in Germany especially fearing these tax decisions that have just been taken? Well, they are fearing that there will be some countermeasures then from the Chinese governments, that then, for example, there will be a higher import taxes for cars from Germany to China. Well, I mean, the German manufacturers are already, and basically almost all manufacturers are also building cars in China for the Chinese market. So they will probably not be affected for that. As I said, VW also has 2 joint ventures actually, because you used to do that then, you know, back in the days. But still, it might have an effect. And so, for example, the German government was voting against these taxes, and the French government, for example, was pushing for these taxes because the French manufacturers aren't really invested in China, and they want to sell, for example, their own small, cheap electric vehicles in Europe. And so it's always a question of interests. It's always a question of money and power, you know, as it always is, sadly. But I think it's really important to understand the individual standpoints. And if you look at the individual standpoint of each country, you can very well understand that. But then it's always the question of how can you come together and how can you prevent this, you know, going to escalate? Because at the end of the day, there has always been better, you know, a better economy and better and more peace and so on if everyone trades with each other, of course on a fair basis. But then the question of definition is what that fair basis actually is. If you want to see more of these background industry videos, tell me in the comments, and see you next time.